So I've been coming across mixed reports that Black Lives Matter is going to stand as a political party in next year's council elections. The next general election, of course, is not scheduled until roughly 2024. It could occur before then, but unlikely. One Black Lives Matter group, I'm not sure which group, I'm not sure where it's based. I've just skimmed over these reports because they're not confirmed at this stage, has apparently made an application to the Electoral Commission to stand as a political party. At the same time, the actor Lawrence Fox has registered his Reclaim party with the Electoral Commission. So the culture wars are in full swing, we can say. Interestingly, though, the Daily Mail reports that Black Lives Matter has now denied this. Whether that's like the main I was going to say the main leaders, but the thing with Black Lives Matter is a bit like Extinction Rebellion. They don't really, as far as I can tell, have a hierarchy as such. So, one faction is saying they are, another faction is saying they aren't. I guess we'll see. It will be interesting to see how well they do. Obviously, any new political party will struggle, but if they get really a very, very poor showing, I think that will be a reflection of how polarizing this group is. If they get a very strong showing, it might indicate that those particular candidates are quite apt at delivering their message. But it will be interesting to see. I actually welcome it. Although I'm very critical of Black Lives Matter, I actually welcome them standing as a political party in order to put themselves up to public mandate. People can judge their statements, their attitudes, their philosophy, and their actions over the past half year, and then judge that at the ballot box. So I actually support the idea of it. I think it could be interesting. Um, I'm not a supporter of Black Lives Matter, the movement, and this is why. I mean, I've mentioned this before, but just in case people missed my last video. Firstly, I do not believe that Black Lives Matter is a straightforward civil rights group as they claim. I think you need to dig in the bit beneath the surface. And I feel strongly that there is a lot of well-meaning people who support Black Lives Matter because they feel it's a way to express their contentions with police brutality. But the United States and the UK are not exactly the same situation. Um, I was certainly sympathetic to the origins of this because I do feel that there were a lot of incidents involving the police that raised very serious questions. And there are fundamental things in the United States system, for example, immunity from prosecution within the justice system for police officers. I forget the formal word for this. That's pretty dubious. And it is true that a lot of black men have been impacted by this. Of course, when we're talking about crime, it gets into a murky area of what is the representation of people targeted by the police versus what is the representation of crimes being committed. And that's a very dicey and grey area. But if we are going to have a candid discussion on these things, then we have to have a candid discussion, i.e., will the police treat a white suspect the same as they treat a black suspect? That's the fundamental question. What Black Lives Matter ignores is there are, in fact, lots of examples of police brutality against white people. That pretty much gets ignored. It may be that it doesn't happen as much, but it does happen. So I think there's an issue here of police accountability. In that sense, I think that there is some ground for the origins of Black Lives Matter. And certainly as a concept, who's going to argue with the statement Black Lives Matter? Of course they matter. There's a lot of contentions I have with this group and this movement. One of them is the very message, Black Lives Matter. Well, what are the main things that kill black people? One of them is black on black violence. It's irrefutable. If you look at American cities like Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis, and indeed in the UK, London, um, more black people are killed in gang violence than they are at police hands. Now, granted, there are a large number of cases where people have died in police custody, and a lot of them are minority people, and perhaps those cases do warrant a lot more scrutiny. I totally concede that. And I do think the police should be transparent and accountable for those sort of situations. It doesn't mean that they're always in the wrong. There may be situations where a prisoner was violent and they had to defend themselves, but that's why they need to be transparent about these things so that we know. And by the way, just for the record, I strongly believe that police who do clearly abuse their power should be held to account and punished, as with anyone else who commits assault. I don't think the police should get special treatment in that sense. But there is also there's a lot of things going on here, and I want to talk about one social dynamic as a negative consequence of Black Lives Matter in just a minute. But I think a lot of people support this movement. You get black people who support it because the movement drills into them the idea that they're perpetual victims. It drills into them that it's a white dominant society that's out to get you. You're being discriminated against because of your skin color, and every shortcoming you have in life is because of your skin color. This is a very dangerous outlook. Um, Feminism does it to some extent with women. I just think it's a very negative thing to constantly drill into people that they are victims, they are victims, they're victims. Um, Of course, this by no means represents all black people. I know of black people who deeply resent Black Lives Matter for precisely that reason. One example is the social commentator Esther Kraku, who's of Ghanaian descent, and she is very vocal in her opposition to Black Lives Matter. She caught my attention because um, I don't want to say it's unusual, but I give credit to those who are willing to speak out and say, well, wait, actually, you don't represent us. You don't represent all black people. Um, but I do think at its core there is racism within Black Lives Matter, and I think the utter failure of senior Black Lives Matter figures to condemn that racism and of the media to scrutinise that racism is nothing short of a disgrace. And I'll give an example of this. Yusra Kogali is a co-founder of the Toronto branch of Black Lives Matter. Now she has come out with some horrible statements dehumanizing white people. And I'm not talking about white supremacists, I am talking about all white people. As an example of this, a left wing activist who was supportive of Black Lives Matter felt that he could no longer support the movement because of her attitude. And he actually wrote an op ed about it, forget the guy's name, but she is a very polarizing figure. She's a co founder. She's not some random member, she was a co founder of a branch in a major city. Now, does Black Lives Matter distance themselves from her statements? No, they're silent, and one can only conclude they therefore support her statements. But I don't think it's just her. I think if you scratch beneath the surface, there are some pretty hostile attitudes within BLM to white people in general. That doesn't mean that I think that every Black Lives Matter activist is a racist, but I do think when you are in an ethnocentric movement, inevitably there is going to be some overlap with racist attitudes in that, insofar as you start to see white people in general as the enemy, except, of course, there's white people who doggedly support the movement. And there are, of course. Um, but I feel that white people who support the movement, it's a combination of things. It's personal guilt. They feel white guilt, which I think is a nonsense. But they also, I think they have good intentions, but maybe they haven't done the research enough on this organization. They think, oh, we're just supportive because we want to show that we're not all the same, we're not all racists, and we understand black concerns. Uh, it's virtue signaling, but it's more than that. It's endorsing a negative movement. It's endorsing a polarizing movement, and that then has consequences, which I'll come to in a minute. Um, but like I say, actually registering as a political party could be interesting because it will be a way for the public to show what they think. Now, obviously, if they register in an area that has a large black population, it may be that they get more support. It may be that they don't get more support. There's historic examples that may be somewhat comparable. The Nation of Islam, no, it's not exactly the same as Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter doesn't really have a religious component. The Nation of Islam obviously did. They were a black supremacist movement. BLM will say that they're not. But they are both polarizing movements. Now, with the Nation of Islam, the vast majority of African Americans didn't support it. And Muhammad Ali, by the way, when he joined them, that dented his popularity because they were a pretty dubious organization with some pretty extreme views. Black Lives Matter, this is another contention I have with them. If you actually start to look into their philosophy, and I assume they would bring these things into policy level if they were standing as a party, some of their ideas are just plain reckless. Defunding the police is a reckless idea. Because what happens if you defund the police? You just get anarchy. If you have no law enforcement, how then do they suppose that the police can protect them from white supremacists? Would they propose, oh, we'll get self-defense units or something? It will turn into anarchy. Scrutinising the police, I support. Holding the police to account, I support. Defunding the police, I do not support. I think it's reckless and wrong. Um, but one of my biggest frustrations with this whole thing is not the movement itself, but the utter failure of the media to hold them to account, ask them tough questions. And it bothers me that senior figures, including Keir Starmer, unfortunately, have felt the need to really pander to this organisation. When Keir Starmer took his ridiculous knee, it was a joke. You know, that was a blatant act of virtue signalling, and it was ridiculous. He could have said, I'm sympathetic to the ideals of Black Lives Matter. I want to talk to Black Lives Matter. I want to work with Black Lives Matter. But to actually take the knee, ridiculous. Dominic Raab, incidentally, got a lot of heat from the left for not doing it, which is absurd. Utterly absurd. Um, kneeling is a subservient gesture. That's what it is. Um, these days, people don't even kneel in front of the Queen, and with good reason. So I think one of the most frustrating things about this is an utter failure for the media to hold them to account. But you get senior figures like Prince Harry. He's just had an interview with the gentleman who helped. He was a Black Lives Matter activist, and he actually famously helped the white guy in the rally. And that was kind of held up to say, "Oh, look, look how gracious they are and what good people they are." My response to that is, he's obviously a decent individual. He's a decent man. He saw the white right wing guy in trouble and he helped him. Huge respect for that. He deserves credit. But just because that's one good act doesn't suddenly legitimize Black Lives Matter. It just shows he's a decent individual. Anyway, Prince Harry was having a conversation with this guy, and he said not until he met Meghan did he become aware of his unconscious bias. As always with white guilt, this is only one-sided. What about the unconscious bias of black people who might be led by Black Lives Matter? And this isn't all black people, because people think for themselves, but there may well be individuals who, because of the dogma and the rhetoric of Black Lives Matter, have the unconscious bias of assuming that the police are always racist. And when you get an MP like Don Butler, who makes very loaded charges of racism against the police who stopped her, even though the windows were tinted and they couldn't see who was in the vehicle. Um, that is reckless. It's actually putting the police in danger. Why? Because it's sending out a message that they are against us, they are the enemy. Um, and we've seen from the two murders of the two officers within the last year that police do face very real risks. Now, the activism of Black Lives Matter has had side effects. One example of this is in London. Now we have a situation whereby whenever a black suspect is arrested, you immediately get a crowd gathering around and shouting racism. They don't bother to stop and check the circumstances. They don't bother to see what the police are acting on. If the police have information that the suspect is 16 years old, black, 6 foot, wearing a blue top, they're obviously going to pursue that. He could be a shoplifter. He could have just committed assault. The victim could well be black. But as a consequence of Black Lives Matter's narrative, the police now have their hands tied because they're in a situation where every time they do their job and they arrest a black suspect, they're accused of racism. So what about the unconscious bias of that? That's one of my biggest contentions with Black Lives Matter. They have went well beyond saying we want to hold the police to account. They're now saying that every time a black person is arrested, it's racism. That's utterly, utterly preposterous. How on earth are the police supposed to do their job? And I think that there needs to be an understanding of the pressures the police face. That doesn't mean exonerating them when they do wrong. It means understanding that they obviously cannot function in that sort of situation. Um, so anyway, I'll wrap this up pretty soon, but there's obvious double standards as well. When the guy flew the White Lives Matter banner over Burnley, he was immediately denounced as far right. And there was a police investigation. They had to drop it because he hadn't actually committed any offence. But I remember at the time, Burnley Football Club, Black Lives Matter, were saying how awful it was, and he was trying to defame the movement. But if you're saying it's okay to say the statement Black Lives Matter, then you can't really say the statement White Lives Matter is wrong. I don't say it. I don't go around to White Lives Matter because I think any ethnocentric movement needs to be, it can be polarizing. But put it this way, all lives matter. Why is that so provocative and triggering to BLM activists? If they are not against the idea of all lives matter, then why are they so hostile to people saying that? That's a question that needs to be answered. And as far as I'm concerned, the media has utterly failed to do their job in this. It's utterly pathetic. It might be because there's ideological bias. I mean, the likes of CNN is never going to question Black Lives Matter. Don Lemon, Jake Tapper, people like that are so ridiculously biased. They won't do their job. They won't ask Black Lives Matter tough questions. There's a few other journalists who will, but I think, much like Extinction Rebellion, they pretty much got off the hook insofar as they have not been thoroughly scrutinised. And the way that segments of the media have pandered to them is utterly pathetic. Now, I'm not saying I expect the media to be hostile to them. I'm just saying they should take an approach of at least asking questions, saying, is it your position that X, Y, and Z? Will you condemn this? Will you condemn that? Has Black Lives Matter condemned looting and rioting? No. What they've said is, oh, we're not involved in that. It's people infiltrating it or whatever. But they haven't actually condemned it, at least not anywhere near enough as they should have. So I also remember in that first big protest in London, which Sadiq Khan ridiculously supported, even though other protests were then banned because of COVID. There was some real vandalism going on. The Union flag was vandalized at the cenotaph of all places. Um, and the idea that if anyone was upset by that, they're somehow far right. It sickens me, to be honest. Black Lives Matter is a deeply polarizing organization, so it's time that the media and politicians stop treating it like it was just a normal civil rights movement. It really isn't. There may be people within Black Lives Matter who are decent people and they're not against white people, but I also think that if you are silent, so if you're a Black Lives Matter activist, you're black or white, I don't care, but you're silent in condemning someone like Yusuf Kigali, then you have no right to pontificate. You really don't. I take the view that if people endorse a movement, it's their responsibility to call out the extremes in their midst. So until they do that, I will regard Black Lives Matter as a polarizing and quasi-racist organization. I say quasi-racist as opposed to racist because I don't believe that every activist is racist. but I do believe you can definitely find pockets of racism within it. And it disgusts me that the media is so pathetic in holding them to account. They just won't do it. So, for all those reasons, it'll be interesting to see if they do stand as a party, and it'll be interesting to see the responses they get. By the way, the thing about White Lives Matter, that taps into this idea that the racist concept of white privilege. I've said it's an absolutely racist concept, but consider young girls who were victims of grooming gangs. They were overwhelmingly white. Surely their lives matter. You know, their lives were shattered by the abuse they received. And we've had cases in the UK of people, three separate cases of young men, different locations, being murdered for no other reason than they were white. That's a fact. It's not race baiting, it's a fact. My take is treat people as individuals. And, you know, when I talk about race baiting, what I'm talking about is not pandering to racial politics. That's why I don't go around talking about white identitarianism. That's why I'm, not a fan of White Lives Matter either. I do see it as a natural response to Black Lives Matter. I think both concepts are polarizing. All lives matter shouldn't be offensive. If you're offended by the term all lives matter, then don't say that you're not against it, because you are clearly against it. Um, we now have this insane situation. If someone says all lives matter, they're smeared as far right. That is insane, absolutely insane. And there needs to be a real blowback against that. Now, as to Mr. Lawrence's party Reclaim, I need to look more into it. I need to see what sort of policies he's putting forth. I'm interested in it, but I'm not quite at the level of supporting it, because I would want to know, is it simply a protest party, or is he really taking it seriously? I've supported Lawrence Fox. I don't support him in absolutely everything. I believe recently he suggested that calling people paedophiles was okay. It's not. It's reckless. And there is responsibility with free speech. But I'm going to look into what sort of direction Reclaim takes. Some have tried to call it a right wing organisation, or the Brexit party of the culture wars. Well, Lawrence Fox voted Remain, so it's not that simple. Anyway, I'll round this up, but it'll be interesting to see what happens.